In 1891, Jacob Waltz lay dying in Phoenix. Beneath his bed, 48 pounds of gold. His last words pointed to a cave in the Superstition Mountains, but when men searched, they found only bones and notes half burned in pockets. What else was buried in dust? A skull beside a trail, a pouch tied in red thread, a map, unfinished. From 1891 to 1930, treasure hunters followed Waltz's clues. Some vanished, some lied, some left ledges crossed in red. When gold was promised, what else slipped into silence? Welcome to history's ledger. The year is 1891 Phoenix. The desert heat did not soften, even as Jacob Waltz lay dying in a small adobe room behind Washington Street. His breath was thin, his words uneven, but beneath his bed sat something that spoke louder than any confession. 48 pounds of gold ore, each piece shot through with yellow so rich it shimmered even in lamplight. People had called him the Dutchman, though he was German. He had prospected for decades in Arizona, drifting between dry washes and jagged ridges, always returning with nothing to show. And yet, here he was, leaving behind ore so pure it should have made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Where had it come from? On his deathbed, Waltz began to speak of the mine. He named landmarks in half-finished sentences: a rock shaped like a man's face, a stone house near a canyon, a trail where water ran north when it should have run south. He admitted to killings, Mexican miners, a nephew, even a stranger who wandered too close. He asked that money be sent to the mother of the boy he had buried, and then his words stopped. Waltz died before finishing the directions. The gold beneath his bed proved the mine had existed, but the silence he left behind proved something else. That obsession outlasts certainty. In the years that followed, men searched the Superstition Mountains with copies of Waltz's words. They found bones, chains, and skulls set upright beside trails. They found maps half burned in pockets, ledges crossed in red, pouches tied with thread but never opened. They found everything but the mine. This is not just a story of gold. It is a story of silence heavier than metal, of luxury glimpsed in velvet-lined furniture and fine paper maps tied with string, of grief written in unfinished notes and ledges that end mid-line. The mystery begins not in the mountains, but in that small adobe room in Phoenix, with a dying man, a chest of gold, and a map that was never finished. In 1891 in Phoenix, Jacob Waltz lay dying in a rented adobe house. For decades he had been known as another aging prospector drifting across Arizona, a man who returned from the mountains with stories but no visible fortune. When fever finally took hold of him, he left behind something no story could dismiss. Beneath his bed was a chest that scraped the floorboards when it was dragged out, heavy with broken rock veined in yellow. The assay later confirmed what every witness already saw with their own eyes: nearly 48 pounds of ore, almost 30% pure. It was the kind of ore that could not be explained away. Men worked whole lifetimes for a fraction of what sat under Waltz's bed, Neighbors whispered. Officials recorded it. The evidence was undeniable. Jacob Waltz had found a source of extraordinary wealth somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. What no one could prove, and what Waltz himself carried to his grave, was where. On his deathbed, he tried to tell the story. His voice faltered, his mind drifting in and out of coherence. At times he spoke clearly, describing a canyon entered by a narrow trail where water ran north when it should have run south. He mentioned a rock shaped like a man's face, a stone house standing near the entrance to the mine, and a ridge marked by a landmark so distinct that no one could mistake it. Then, his words slipped into silence or turned back on themselves, as though he could not hold the picture steady long enough to finish. The details that did emerge were troubling. He admitted to Holmes, the young man who kept vigil by his bed, that the mine's history was written in blood. He spoke of Mexican miners killed when they had staked the claim before him. He mentioned his own nephew from Germany, whose grave was shallow and unmarked, a stranger who had strayed too close, silenced before word could spread. The gold was proof of fortune, but his last words were proof of guilt. Waltz asked Holmes that if anything was taken from the chest, money be sent to the boy's mother. It was as close to repentance as the old man ever came. Holmes tried to keep track, straining to turn fragments into direction. He asked about the canyon, about which ridge to follow, about the flow of water. But the answers circled and broke apart. Waltz repeated the same pieces, left the most vital questions hanging, and never gave a single instruction that could stand on its own. Before Holmes could draw the map in his head, Waltz's breathing failed him. By dawn, Jacob Waltz was gone. The chest remained. The ore was real, tested and weighed. It proved there had been a mine, close enough to carry ore piece by piece back to town. But the location, the landmarks, the final direction, died in fragments with him. What he left was not a map, not a set of coordinates, but silence. That silence became the heart of the story. Holmes left the house carrying ore, and soon his life changed. Tax records showed a new wagon, a small ranch, and velvet-lined furniture appearing within a year. Julia Thomas, the woman who had taken Waltz in, felt cheated. She led her own expedition into the superstitions, guided by what she had heard of his last words. The summer heat drove them back with nothing to show. Desperate, she sold fine paper maps tied with string for $10 apiece, each one claiming to hold Waltz's true directions. Maps multiplied. Hunters followed. But each expedition ended in the same way, empty-handed or worse. Bones were found in washes, chains still looped around skeletons, skulls set upright beside trails, and notebooks with pages half burned. The chest under Waltz's bed proved the mine was real. But the mine itself, sealed in fragments and unfinished words, slipped into silence. And silence, heavier than 48 pounds of ore, was what every hunter carried into the desert afterward. The desert around the Superstition Mountains did not forgive, but it remembered. Heat baked the ridges until they cracked like clay left too long in the kiln, and wind carved grooves into rock that seemed older than any map. Travelers often spoke of silence here, not the absence of sound, but the kind that presses on the ears until a man starts to hear his own heartbeat too clearly. After Waltz's death, the desert became the true keeper of the story. Men carried his fragments of directions into the range, convinced that ore as pure as what had been found beneath his bed could only come from a vein nearby. They carried shovels, rifles, and water jugs that dried too quickly. They also carried tokens of luxury, compasses with polished brass covers, silver tobacco tins, even journals bound in calfskin, as though wealth in small things could guide them to greater fortune. Many of those objects were later found abandoned in washes, their owners long vanished. Holmes searched first. He had the strongest claim, though others doubted his version of Waltz's confession. He kept some of the ore, sold portions discreetly, and with the money bought velvet-lined chairs and a new wagon, small comforts that drew attention. To his neighbors, the furniture was as loud as the ore itself. It was proof that Waltz had spoken to him alone, and proof that the story was not just a prospector's fantasy. Julia Thomas, feeling cheated, organized her own attempt. She outfitted herself and two partners with supplies, trusting that Waltz's half sentences were enough to carry them. They chose the worst season, the heat rising off rock until boots stuck in sand, canteens warming until the water tasted of metal. By the time they staggered back to Phoenix, they had no gold and barely their lives. To recoup losses, Thomas began selling maps. She printed them on fine paper, tied with string, sold for $10 apiece. Some were careful drawings, with rivers marked and ridges labeled. Others were crude sketches, copied so often that the landmarks blurred into nonsense. Buyers didn't care. They wanted possession of the map more than proof of its truth. The desert answered with its own record, not gold, but bones. Hunters returned with stories of skulls upright beside trails, as though placed to warn others. Chains were found rusted around skeletons. Pouches were recovered, some tied with red thread, their contents never opened. In one case, a boot was discovered beside a lantern crushed by stone. The leather cracked, the iron fittings on the lamp bent by heat. These were not treasures, but they carried the weight of evidence. The desert was not silent. It was writing in the only language it knew, remains. Luxury was always present, even in death. A silver ring on a bone hand gleamed in moonlight before searchers buried it again. Fragments of maps, drawn on thick stock and wrapped in waxed cloth, were found in the pockets of men who never came home. One note, half burned, read only, "If you find it," and nothing more. That unfinished sentence echoed Waltz's own silence, a reminder that the mine remained guarded not by curses, but by absence. For Holmes, the gold beneath Waltz's bed had been enough to buy comforts. For Thomas, the mine became a trade in maps. For others, it became a grave. The desert itself did not distinguish between them. It preserved ore, bones, velvet and parchment alike. The superstitions never yielded the mine, but they never forgot the search. Every rusted chain, every abandoned journal, every luxury object out of place in the dust became part of their archive, and like any archive, it grew heavier with each edition. After Julia Thomas returned from her failed expedition, the desert still seemed to cling to her. She had given Waltz food and shelter in his last weeks, had listened as he coughed through half-finished sentences, had believed she could turn those fragments into fortune. Instead, she nearly lost her life in the heat. What she did not lose was the story. Back in Phoenix, she and her partners turned to another trade. They began selling maps, $10 each, a fortune for many at the time. The maps were printed on fine paper stock, wrapped with twine, and handed over to buyers who believed that ink could do what shovels had not. Some were carefully drawn, with rivers marked, peaks labeled, and dotted lines tracing imagined paths into the superstitions. Others were crude sketches, lines running jagged across the page, landmarks more rumor than cartography. No two were alike. Some showed the rock shaped like a man. Others marked the location of a stone house, a ruin that had never been rediscovered. A few included instructions at sunrise or sunset, promising that shadows would reveal what the eye could not. Each map seemed certain. Each was different. Buyers did not care. They tucked the maps into leather folios, stored them in trunks lined with velvet, and carried them into the desert as though possession itself were a kind of insurance. One man framed his map in wood and glass, displaying it in his parlor beside a silver lamp, proof that he owned a key others could only dream of. Another folded his until the paper wore thin at the creases, convinced the wear itself made it truer. Hunters carried these papers into the superstitions and left little else behind but fragments. A map burned at the edges, pulled from the pocket of a man found collapsed near a dry wash. Another with ink blurred by sweat, recovered from a campsite abandoned in haste. A journal bound in calfskin recorded one such expedition. Stone Cross, seen at dusk, it read. The next page was blank. The maps multiplied, but the mine never appeared. Instead, the silence deepened. For every new version that claimed to hold the truth, another body returned, or failed to return at all. The chalice etched in gold drawn on one copy was dismissed as invention. Yet it reappeared again in another, and another still, until it seemed less like a fabrication and more like a memory passed from hand to hand. The desert's own record grew heavier. Bones were discovered where no map had marked them. Chains lay rusted in washes that no drawing had predicted. Boots, cracked and stiff, with initials scratched at the heel, were found half buried in sand. These objects told their own story, one not of discovery, but of collapse. The irony was plain even then. The more maps that were sold, the further the mine receded. Certainty did not grow, it fractured. Every new chart layered more silence over the original chest of ore beneath Waltz's bed. The mine was not found, but the maps, each false, each unfinished, each folded into leather and passed across tables, became the true inheritance. They carried the mystery forward, convincing each new hunter that the silence could be broken. It never was. And so the superstitions became a library of unanswered directions, a place where fine paper maps decayed in the pockets of the dead, where luxury lingered in fragments, and where absence outlived proof. The first expeditions into the superstitions after Waltz's death were not grand enterprises. They were small parties of locals and prospectors who had bought Julia Thomas's maps or copied the sketches by hand. They set out in wagons rattling with water barrels, rifles and shovels, chasing a picture on paper into country that cared little for lines and words. The land punished quickly. The sun beat down until lips split and hands blistered against tools. The wind carried grit that settled into teeth and eyelids. A trail might promise shade and deliver only dry stone. Men spat dust and pressed forward, convinced each ridge would reveal the landmarks Waltz had described. Some claimed they saw them, a boulder shaped faintly like a man's head, a collapsed wall of stone that could have been the ruins of a house, shadows at dusk stretching across washes as though pointing to secrets beneath the ground. Each sighting filled journals with sketches and notes, but when the camps were abandoned, the pages stopped without conclusion, just as Waltz's own sentences had. The desert left its own entries, a boot sole, cracked and curling at the edges, found beside a rusted shovel. A water canteen split open and bleached by heat. A strip of paper tucked into a rock crevice, its ink faded except for 2 words, North Face. None of these led to gold. All of them led to more questions. One party returned with a single artifact, a small pouch trimmed with faded thread, discovered in a shallow wash. The leather was stiff, the knot unbroken. They argued for days over whether to open it. In the end, they carried it back to town untouched, as though its mystery was more valuable sealed than revealed. Others returned with nothing but silence. Some did not return at all. The treasure was no closer, but the legend grew heavier. Each failed hunt added another layer of uncertainty. If the maps had been false, why did bones appear where Waltz had said they would? If the mine was myth, why had ore of such purity been hidden beneath his bed? The desert answered with fragments and silence, but never with gold. And yet men kept walking into its ridges, carrying fine paper maps folded in pockets, convinced the story could still be finished. The superstitions began keeping their own record after Waltz was gone, and it was written not in maps, but in remains. Searchers who carried Julia Thomas's papers or Holmes's whispered fragments walked into canyons with hope folded in their pockets. Too many never walked out. The desert did not erase them completely. It left entries of its own. A skull set upright beside a trail, white, clean, the jaw missing. Whoever placed it had arranged it carefully, as if it were meant as a marker or a warning. The sight chilled those who found it more than any false map could. In a shallow wash, a body was uncovered, with a chain looped still around the torso. Rust had fused the links together, bones pressed through fabric that had once been canvas, now brittle as parchment. Holmes himself claimed this was exactly as Waltz had described, a grave from his confessions, proof that the old man's words had been more than fevered rambling. Hunters carried these memories home, and they did not come back the same. Their journals tell of it. One writes that the air smelled of iron when he uncovered the chain. Another that the silence of the canyon pressed so hard against his ears that he heard his own pulse pounding. There were notes too, half burned in pockets. One fragment read, "Water runs against," and the page ended there, charred into nothing. Another held only a name, written once, crossed through in red ink. The grief of families who waited in Phoenix and Mesa was heavier than the gold ore Waltz had hidden. A wife kept her husband's ledger on the mantle, open to the last line he had written before vanishing. Children grew up with stories of fathers swallowed by the desert, names spoken quietly because they were reminders not of fortune, but of absence. Luxury, too, was part of the ledger. A silver ring found still on a bone hand, glinting in the sun before it was buried again. A pouch tied with red thread, discovered sealed, its contents never revealed. Proof that some mysteries felt safer unopened. These were the objects that carried both weight and regret. They proved someone had stood in those mountains and believed they were close. The ledger of bones was never complete. For every skull placed like a marker, for every burned page or rusted chain, more men disappeared without a trace at all. Their silence became another entry, unwritten but just as heavy. The mine was never found, but the grief of those who searched became the truest record. It was written in loss, in regret that stretched across families, in the collapse of men who chased all they would never hold. The desert kept those accounts faithfully, and it still does. When Jacob Waltz died, it was Dick Holmes who carried away more than all. He carried the burden of unfinished words. Holmes kept some of the gold and sold it quietly. Within a year, neighbors noticed changes. A new wagon standing in front of his home, a small ranch bought on credit now paid, velvet-lined chairs and furniture that no struggling young man should have afforded. The records of Maricopa County confirmed it. Waltz's chest beneath the bed had transformed into Holmes's comforts. But the gold was not enough. The ore proved the mine existed, yet the fragments of direction that Waltz had whispered in his final hours refused to settle. Holmes convinced himself that with patience he could finish the map the old man had left undone. He spent 14 years searching, tracing the canyons Waltz had described, following the water that ran north when it should have run south. He carried journals of his own, recording cairns and shadows, each entry a bid to bring order to chaos. But like Waltz's confession, Holmes's ledgers ended in silence. Notes trailed into half sentences, directions turned back on themselves. One page marked a stone house, but never explained where. Another ended with "Sun Cuts Ridge," and nothing more. The obsession did not die with him. His son, George Brownie Holmes inherited not only his father's papers, but also the silence between them. Brownie grew up watching the furniture his father had purchased, the velvet, the polished wood, the fine wagon, reminders that fortune was real, yet incomplete. He listened to the same landmarks, the man-shaped rock, the stone house, the wash with bones and chain. He inherited both proof and absence. Brownie spent decades wandering the superstitions, convinced that he would finish what his father had begun. He grew old tracing the same ridges, walking paths already worn thin, carrying journals that echoed the same silence. When he died in 1980, the mine remained where it always had, just out of reach. The Holmes legacy was not gold. It was obsession carried across generations, wealth turned into velvet and wagons, then into ledges that ended mid-line. Each heir carried the same fragments, the same unanswered questions, the same weight of silence. The chest beneath Waltz's bed had been emptied long ago, but the inheritance it left behind still pressed heavily on the Holmes family, proof that some treasures are measured not in bullion, but in the collapse of those who chase them. George Brownie Holmes grew up in the shadow of a story his father never finished. He was born in the 1890s, just a year after Jacob Waltz died, and from the beginning, he lived surrounded by reminders of that chest of ore. His father, Dick Holmes, had bought velvet-lined furniture and a polished wagon with money from Waltz's gold. Neighbors never forgot it, neither did Brownie. As a boy, he heard the landmarks repeated like bedtime stories, the rock shaped like a man, the stone house by a canyon, the water flowing the wrong way. His father kept journals filled with fragments of Waltz's confession, and when he died in 1933, Brownie inherited them along with the silence between the lines. By the 1940s, Brownie was the one walking the ridges of the superstitions. He studied the same notes his father had written, tracing sentences that ended mid-thought. Stone wall, north face, and then nothing. Each trip felt like chasing ghosts. Yet he returned again and again, as though the weight of inheritance was heavier than the heat. Hunters who met him described him as a man who carried both proof and absence. Proof in the form of his father's journals, maps folded into leather cases, and stories passed down from Waltz's deathbed. Absence in the way every search ended the same, with dust, silence, and more questions. Brownie was not alone. He shared his obsession with a rancher named Clay Worst, who came to know the Holmes family well. Clay listened carefully to Brownie's accounts, examined the ore samples passed from hand to hand, and studied the directions that had become legend. He, too, walked the desert in search of the mine. By then, almost half a century had passed since Waltz's death. The world had changed. Arizona had become a state in 1912. Phoenix had grown into a city, and still men entered the superstitions with fine paper maps tucked in their packs, each claiming to be the one true copy of Waltz's directions. Each map disagreed with the others. Each ended in silence. Brownie carried the obsession until his death in 1980. He never found the mine, But he left behind more papers, more copies, more fragments, an inheritance not of wealth, but of unfinished lines and unanswered questions. For the Holmes family, the mine was never just about gold. It was about what was carried forward. Velvet chairs that aged in parlors, journals bound in calfskin, heirloom maps passed to outsiders like clay. Proof of wealth that once sat beneath Waltz's bed, and proof that silence, once inherited, is almost impossible to bury. The gold never came home. What remained was inheritance measured in grief, obsession, and fragments written across nearly a century of desert dust. In the summer of 1931, Adolf Ruth left Phoenix for the Superstition Mountains. He was 75 years old, his body frail, his steps slowed by age. Yet he carried himself with the confidence of a man certain he was closer than anyone had ever been. The desert gave no mercy. By morning, the air shimmered with heat waves that bent the horizon. Dust clung to his boots, filled the folds of his trousers, and turned water to mud in his mouth. The silence in the canyons was thick, broken only by cicadas shrilling in mesquite tree or the dry rattle of gravel spilling beneath his cane. Each breath scraped at his throat, each step pressed against stone that burned beneath the sun. He had spoken freely of his purpose before leaving. The map he carried, he claimed, had come from Mexico, a document tied somehow to Waltz's original directions. He showed it to strangers, confident enough to believe its possession made the mine his. He told others that soon the Dutchman's secret would no longer be a secret at all. Ruth walked into the superstitions and vanished. Weeks passed. Searchers scoured the trails until one discovery stopped them cold. A skull, sitting upright beside a faint path. The desert had done its work. The bone bleached white, the jaw missing. 2 small holes in the cranium suggested bullets had come before the heat. It was not chance placement. Someone had set the skull carefully, facing the trail like a warning. Months later, the rest of his remains were found nearly a mile away. Scattered bones, a broken belt buckle that still carried the faint smell of iron when lifted. A rusted canteen split open, the sand around it stained darker from water that had long since dried. His camp had been disturbed, his gear scattered by time, wind, or hands unknown. Not everything was gone. In his pack, searchers recovered a notebook. The paper was brittle, edges curled by heat, but ink still marked the page. On it, Ruth had written, Veni, Vidi, Vici, 200 feet from the cave. I came, I saw, I conquered. His last words suggested triumph, as though he had finally stood on the threshold of what men had sought for decades. The map that had brought him there was missing. News spread quickly. By August, headlines in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles told of the Arizona desert that had claimed an old man with a foreign map. Newspapers printed sketches of the Superstition Mountains, retold Waltz's deathbed confession, and reminded readers of the 48 pounds of gold ore that had once been hidden under his bed in Phoenix. Waltz's secret was no longer a local legend. It was a national story. The details, the skull placed upright, the notebook without the map, the words written as if victory had been achieved just before death, only deepened the mystery. Did Ruth truly find the mine? Was he killed for it? Or had the desert simply taken another man too old and too fragile for its silence? The five senses returned in every account. The heat that bent vision until the mountains looked like mirages. The dust that filled mouths until water was bitter. The silence that pressed against ears until men thought they heard whispers in the wind. The sharp tang of iron on bone and buckle. The stark sight of a skull staring from the side of a trail. The desert, as always, had left fragments, but never the whole story. Ruth's death did not prove the mine existed, but it gave the legend new life. During the Depression, when men across the country searched for hope in soil and stone, Ruth's story drew thousands more to the superstitions. They carried copied maps in leather cases, notebooks bound in calfskin, and dreams folded into fine paper. They told themselves they could succeed where Ruth had failed. The mine remained hidden, the silence remained heavier, and the desert's ledger grew by one more name. After Adolf Ruth's death in 1931, the Dutchman story left Arizona and entered the nation's imagination. Newspapers in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles carried the headlines. They printed the photograph of his skull, retold the note he had left in his notebook. Veni, Vidi, Vici, 200 feet from the cave, and reminded readers of Jacob Waltz, the dying prospector who had once hidden 48 pounds of gold ore beneath his bed in Phoenix. The timing mattered. America was in the grip of the Depression. Men who had lost farms, jobs, and homes looked westward with desperation, telling themselves that a lost fortune hidden in Arizona stone could change their lives. Trains brought strangers to Phoenix. They walked into the superstitions carrying canteens, rifles, and maps, copied onto fine paper, sold in hotel lobbies and bar rooms. Some maps were rolled into leather cases, others folded so often that the creases nearly tore the landmarks in half. Each one promised certainty. Each one disagreed with the others. The mountains did not care. By mid-decade, camps dotted the canyons. The smell of wood smoke clung to the air. Nights brought the sound of shovels scraping against dry earth. Journals from these parties describe hope as much as hardship. One entry notes the feel of paper growing soft with sweat in a prospector's pocket. Another describes how the silence at dusk grew so deep it made men whisper without realizing it. A few voices still survive in fragments. Around a campfire, a man was overheard saying quietly, "If I don't come back, bury me where the shadow falls." His companion said nothing. The words were recorded later in the margin of a notebook, just beneath a sketch of a can. The desert left its answers in the same way it always had. Bones scattered near trails, a rusted pistol beside a crushed boot, a silver ring found on a hand no longer alive, maps burned at the edges, carried out in pockets of men who had collapsed before reaching town. Luxury persisted in strange places. A farmer from Illinois carried his map in a silk handkerchief, convinced the fabric itself would protect it from the desert's heat. A former banker brought a compass with an engraved brass case, polished so carefully it gleamed even in the dim light of a lantern. These objects returned to town long after their owners did not. The mine remained hidden. The obsession did not. By the 1940s, the Dutchman's gold had become part of American folklore, a story told in barrooms, passed across kitchen tables, folded into letters, and whispered in tents beneath canyon walls. The superstitions no longer belonged only to Arizona. They belonged to every man who thought silence could be broken with paper and a shovel. But the mountains had kept their silence through generations, and in their ledger, another column of names had been added, men who came with maps and left only bones. The superstitions have always been crowded with symbols. Waltz named them on his deathbed: a rock shaped like a man's face, a stone house by a canyon, shadows that moved like hands across the desert floor. For every generation of searchers, these signs became more important than the gold itself. Hunters swore they found them. One man described a boulder staring down at him like a sentinel. Another claimed to have stepped inside the foundation of a house made from stacked stone, its walls still holding against the wind. But when others followed, the landmarks were gone. The rock was just another ridge. The house collapsed back into rubble. Even the shadows betrayed memory. The same can that seemed to point toward a secret at dawn stood meaningless at noon. The desert magnified the confusion. Heat warped vision until cliffs looked like doorways. The wind carried dust sharp enough to sting the eyes, forcing men to squint until every ridge blurred. The silence was so complete that footsteps echoed louder than they should, making it easy to believe the land itself was alive, waiting. Fragments were carried out, a journal page scorched at the edges, the words smeared but legible enough to read. Man Rock, Shadow East. Another note, written in faded ink, marked only with an X beside the word Stone House. None gave directions that held true for long. Luxury still lingered, even in failure. A hunter wrapped his map in silk, convinced it would protect the ink from sweat. Another carried a silver compass with an etched lid, polished each morning before setting out. These details mattered more to the men who found them later than to those who carried them in. Small proofs that someone else had believed, and that belief had cost them. Bones appeared in the places the clues were supposed to be. A crushed boot beside a lantern broken in two. A skull upright near the trail, the rest of the body gone. A pouch tied with faded cord that no one dared untie. The mine remained hidden. The symbols kept dissolving into silence. Every clue, every object, every mark in the stone promised resolution. None delivered it. The desert had written its own lesson. Shadows shift, landmarks vanish, paper burns. What remains is not certainty, but silence. If this story held you, let us know. Like the video, leave a comment. Subscribe so the next forgotten ledger waits for you before the silence does. When George Brownie Holmes grew old, the superstition story aged with him. He had inherited not only his father's journals, but also the silence between them. Dick Holmes had carried Waltz's confession out of Phoenix in 1891, along with ore so pure it bought a new wagon, a ranch, and velvet-lined chairs that still sat in the family parlor decades later. Brownie had grown up with those chairs, reminders that gold had been real, even if the mine itself remained hidden. By the 1970s, Brownie was an old man himself, his body worn by the same desert that had consumed so many others. He still carried the fragments of Waltz's directions, the man-shaped rock, the stone house, the canyon where water ran the wrong way. He still walked the ridges when his legs allowed it, his boots pressing into dust his father had already crossed. The journals he inherited had yellowed with age. The ink had faded, but the words were still there. Stone wall, east face, shadow at dawn. Another page ended with South Ridge, Man Rock, and then silence. Brownie copied the fragments again and again, convinced that if he wrote them enough, the meaning would sharpen. But like his father's notes, his own pages trailed into blank spaces. Visitors who came to see him in his final years recalled his quiet intensity. On his desk sat a leather-bound ledger, its corners rubbed smooth from decades of turning. Inside were not complete maps, but sketches of ridges and cairns, marks that echoed Waltz's own broken sentences. He showed them sparingly, and always with hesitation, as though opening the book too often would weaken what little certainty it held. Sometimes he would open a small box and let guests see pieces of ore, heavy, rough, flecked with yellow. Samples said to have come from the Dutchman's mine. They were fragments of proof, passed from hand to hand like heirlooms. The ore had the metallic smell of iron and copper, sharp enough to cling to fingertips long after the stone was set down. In his final months, Brownie spoke less about finding the mine and more about carrying it forward. He told friends that the story had been his life's inheritance, and whether the gold was ever uncovered was less important than the silence that surrounded it. "It's still there," he once whispered to a visitor, not as a boast, but as a burden. When he died in 1980, his papers were passed to Clay Worst, a rancher who had listened patiently to Brownie's accounts for years. Clay became the new guardian of the fragments. He inherited not wealth, but silence pressed into ink and ore. The Holmes Legacy ended as it began, with ore in hand, velvet in parlors, maps folded into leather cases, and words that trailed off mid-line. The mine had not been found, but the obsession had outlived another generation, and the desert ledger grew heavier still, carrying the names of men who could not let silence rest. By the late 20th century, the Dutchman story no longer belonged only to families or prospectors. It had grown into folklore, the kind of tale whispered to visitors in Phoenix hotels and retold on tours of the superstitions. The mine became a destination, not just for searchers, but for dreamers, But the curse of inheritance still lingered. The Holmes family had passed its papers to Clay Worst, who preserved them with the care of a man holding history in his hands. He showed them rarely, leather-bound journals filled with sketches of ridges, fragments of Waltz's last words, and maps copied too many times to trust. On his shelves, a small box of ore samples remained, heavy and metallic, their smell sharp and unmistakable when the lid was lifted. Each fragment of stone was proof of gold, and yet proof of silence too. A reminder that ore could be carried, but the mine itself could not. Elsewhere, museums displayed Waltz's photograph, his stern face staring from glass cases. Exhibits featured the ore, the chest it once sat in, and even velvet chairs said to have been bought with Waltz's treasure. Visitors pressed their faces to glass, listening to guides describe the dying prospector, the chest beneath his bed, and the unfinished map that had swallowed generations. Meanwhile, on trails leading into the superstitions, new searchers carried maps printed on fine paper and sold in gift shops. Some were careful reproductions, others playful forgeries, but each carried the same allure, the possibility that silence might break for the one person who held the right copy. The desert still resisted. Heat pressed down until sweat turned bitter on the tongue. Dust filled boots until every step grated. The smell of creosote clung after rain, masking the scent of stone and sage. Shadows moved across ridges and fooled men into believing they had seen the man-shaped rock, the stone house, or the cross Waltz had described. And each time, the landmarks dissolved when the light shifted. The obsession endured in softer ways too. Families still held onto heirloom maps folded into leather cases or boxes tied with faded cord. In living rooms, drawers held fragments that children were warned not to touch, sketches, letters, scraps of ore. The silence had become generational, and inheritance as binding as wealth. The curse of inheritance was not the loss of life in the mountains. It was the weight of carrying fragments that could never be finished. Velvet furniture outlived its owners. Journals outlived their authors. Ore samples outlived the men who had died searching for more. The Dutchman's mine had not been found, but the obsession it left behind had become the real treasure, passed down, displayed in glass, whispered in tours, carried in silence. And the silence, as always, was heavier than the gold. By the mid-20th century, the Dutchman's mine was no longer just a family obsession or a prospector's dream. It had become a public attraction. Newspapers promoted it. Guides offered tours into the superstitions. Gift shops in Phoenix sold maps on fine paper, rolled and tied with cord, promising visitors their own piece of the legend. The story of Jacob Waltz's chest, the 48 pounds of ore beneath his bed, was retold in museums, alongside displays of ore samples, faded photographs, and velvet chairs said to have been bought with his treasure. Tourists leaned close to glass cases, staring at the gold flecks in stone, and asked themselves the same question that had haunted searchers for decades. If ore this rich was real, why not the mine? But the mountains did not change. The heat still pressed down on canyon floors until boots stuck in soft sand. The air still carried dust, sharp enough to sting the eyes and cling to sweat. The silence still grew so thick at dusk that men lowered their voices without realizing it. Tourism brought laughter and photographs, but the desert still demanded its toll. Some hikers never returned. Rangers found their packs abandoned, maps folded neatly inside, water long gone. Bones turned up where no trail should have led. A rusted lantern beside a crushed boot. A pouch tied with faded string, its contents still sealed. The line between tourist and treasure hunter blurred. Some came for stories and photographs. Others came quietly, carrying notebooks bound in leather, convinced that Waltz's words still waited to be completed. Every new disappearance fed the legend. Every skull found near a trail made the headlines louder. Yet the mine itself remained in silence. The paradox grew heavier. The Dutchman's gold became entertainment for the many, but ruin for the few who tried to break the silence. Would you have been content to look through glass at ore in a museum? To buy a printed map and leave it folded in a drawer? Or would you have walked into the ridges with the heat pressing down, convinced you could be the one to finish what Jacob Waltz began? The superstitions never answered those questions. They only kept their own ledger, written in ore samples, velvet furniture, bones, and silence. Adolf Ruth's death in the summer of 1931 did not end with his skull beside a trail. It began there. His story rippled outward into newspapers, bar rooms, museums, and families who had never set foot in the Arizona desert. The words in his notebook, Veni, Vidi, Vici, 200 feet from the cave, became a refrain. Hunters repeated it like scripture. Some copied it into the margins of their own ledgers, underlined as though it were proof that the mine had been real and that Ruth had been within reach. The echo carried sensory weight. His skull, bleached white by weeks in the sun, was the image people remembered. Searchers wrote of the heat pressing so hard it seemed to bend the horizon, of dust that stuck to their tongues until water tasted like metal, of silence that made every footfall feel like trespass. They described the faint smell of iron when they handled Ruth's belt buckle, still corroded when found beside his bones. Luxury was never far away, even in death. Ruth's notebook, leather-bound, its pages brittle from heat, survived the desert more faithfully than he did. Copies of his map multiplied, some printed on fine paper, others passed down as heirlooms, each one claiming to trace the same directions. None agreed completely. Decades later, Ruth's story still circled through the superstitions. Tour guides spoke his name. Prospectors invoked his fate as both warning and encouragement. Some swore they had stood where he had stood, felt the shadow fall across stone, believed that one more step, one more turn of the shovel, would have finished the search he could not. But the mine never appeared. Only the echo of his words remained. 200 feet from the cave. Would you have stopped there? Would you have turned back, satisfied with fragments? Or would you have gone further, chasing a sentence into silence, knowing the desert had already claimed the man who wrote it. The superstitions gave no reply. They kept Ruth's bones, his missing map, and his silence, and they added his name to their ledger, a man who came, who saw, who claimed victory, but who never returned. When Adolf Ruth's skull was carried down from the superstitions in 1931, the mine became more than an Arizona legend. It became a story for the entire country, printed in papers coast to coast. And the timing could not have been sharper. America was deep in the Depression. Men who had lost farms, jobs, and families looked westward with desperation, convinced that fortune could still be pulled from the ground. The superstitions filled with searchers. Some came in wagons creaking with supplies. Others arrived by train with little more than a canteen, a shovel, and a folded map bought in Phoenix for a few dollars. They carried fine paper copies, inked with landmarks that contradicted one another but all promised the same prize. Camps sprouted along canyon floors. Fires burned low at night, the smell of mesquite smoke drifting against the desert wind. The sound of shovels echoed through dry washes, clinking against stone that yielded nothing. Mornings began with the taste of bitter coffee sipped from tin cups and ended with sweat-soaking shirts until fabric clung like a second skin. Luxury trailed even into desperation. A few men kept their maps in leather cases, pulling them out as if reverence alone could unlock the riddle. One searcher carried a brass compass with an engraved lid, polishing it before each day's march, though it pointed him only in circles. Another had inherited a silver watch, said to have belonged to his father, who had searched before him. He wound it carefully each night, as if its ticking could measure progress where the land gave none. The desert recorded their failure with the same quiet precision it always had. A notebook half burned in a campfire, a boot left beside a lantern crushed by falling rock, a pouch tied shut with faded cord, discovered unopened in the sand. No one ever claimed the mine. The paradox was sharper in these years. The poorer the men who came, the finer the things they carried. They believed fortune was near, close enough to justify velvet dreams and polished compasses. But each new disappearance, each return with empty hands, added only more silence. Would you have believed Ruth's words, 200 feet from the cave, and walked deeper into that heat? Would you have traded hunger for the chance of gold, carrying a map folded in silk or paper, convinced it could break the silence? The depression filled the mountains with bodies. The gold remained hidden. The silence grew heavier. The superstitions did not return the mine. They returned fragments, ore samples, velvet heirlooms in Phoenix parlors, and bones scattered beneath stone. And those fragments, more than the gold itself, became the truest wealth the desert offered, proof of obsession, inheritance of silence, the weight of absence passed into another generation. When the depression faded, the Dutchman's mind did not. What changed was how the story was carried forward. The mountains grew quieter for a time, but the obsession lived on in fragments, scraps of paper, bits of ore, heirlooms that weighed more than gold because they carried silence with them. Some families kept boxes beneath beds or in closets, filled not with bullion but with relics, or samples said to have come from Waltz himself. Rough, heavy, the metallic scent sharp enough to cling to fingertips. A pouch tied with faded cord, its knot so stiff no one dared untie it. Journals with yellowing pages, words trailing off mid-sentence. They were not maps, not really. They were reminders. Visitors to these homes remembered the strangeness of it. In parlors where the furniture was worn, a single piece might stand out. A velvet-lined chair, bought long ago with Waltz's gold, now surrounded by silence. On desks sat leather-bound ledgers, rubbed smooth at the corners, opened sometimes to show sketches of ridges, cans, or the man-shaped rock. Children were warned not to touch. To handle the papers was to disturb something fragile, something heavier than it looked. The superstitions kept their part of the archive too. Shards of burned maps found near old fire pits. A rusted coffee pot beside bones in a shallow wash. Footprints pressed into sandstone and left to harden under decades of sun. If the desert wrote history, it wrote it in fragments. Never a whole page. Never enough to finish the sentence. Luxury carried its own contradictions. In museums, ore samples sat behind glass, displayed under electric light as curiosities. Visitors leaned close to see the gold flecks shining inside stone. Yet in private homes, similar samples were hidden in drawers, taken out only at night, when the room was quiet enough to believe they mattered. Families guarded them like sacred relics, not for their value, but for the silence they represented. The inheritance was not always physical. Sometimes it was only a memory of words spoken by a grandfather who had searched and failed, or the story of a neighbor who vanished into the canyons and never returned. A few still remembered Brownie Holmes, sitting at his desk with his father's journals, insisting softly, "It's still there." Words passed like heirlooms themselves. Would you want to inherit such a thing? A map with missing lines, a pouch tied shut, a velvet chair that whispers of all beneath a bed. Is that treasure, or is it burden? The tension lay in that question. Some families chose to display fragments proudly, pointing to ore samples as proof that fortune had once been close. Others kept them hidden, locked away, ashamed of how much had been lost to silence. Both approaches said the same thing. The mine was not finished. The story was not done. Even now, some of those fragments surface at estate sales, on ranches passed down through generations, or in collections guarded by private hands. A photograph of Waltz, his face stern under glass. A note written in faded ink, with only 3 words visible. Near the shadow. A silver watch with an engraving inside the lid, carried into the mountains and never claimed by its owner. None of these things reveal the mine, but each one keeps the silence alive. The inheritance is not wealth. It is obsession, grief, and regret, folded into objects that outlast the people who carried them. and the superstitions still wait, holding whatever truth they have beneath stone. By the late 20th century, the Dutchman's mind belonged as much to tourists as to treasure hunters. Phoenix had grown into a city, the desert paved with highways, yet the story of Jacob Waltz's gold still drew people east toward the Superstition Mountains. Museums displayed fragments behind glass. Ore samples sat under lights, flecks of gold catching the eye as visitors leaned closer. Waltz's photograph hung on the wall, his stern face framed like a relic. A corner exhibit featured velvet chairs said to have been purchased with his ore, preserved more carefully than the homes they once sat in. Some visitors touched the glass and whispered, "If this was real, why not the mine?" Gift shops sold maps printed on fine paper, rolled and tied with string. Some were carefully designed, their ink neat, their symbols ornate. Others were little more than playful sketches, made to feed curiosity. Buyers didn't care which was true. They wanted to fold a piece of the legend into their pocket, to carry a fragment of silence back home. On weekends, tour guides led groups into the foothills. They pointed to ridges and said, "That's where the man-shaped rock should be." They gestured at washes and added, "Some say bones were found there." The desert gave them props, rusted cans, broken lanterns, scattered boot leather. Even ordinary stones took on meaning when arranged beneath a story. The tourists saw folklore, but the mountains did not soften for them. Heat pressed against the skin until sweat stung the eyes. Dust clung to shoes and turned water bitter. Silence swallowed voices when the group spread too far apart. A ranger once remarked that even laughter died quickly here, as if the stone walls did not allow joy to echo. For hunters who still carried the obsession, the shift to tourism felt like mockery. They studied the maps in glass cases, whispered about the journals kept in private collections, and resented the idea of the Dutchman's mind sold as entertainment. Some still walked into the superstitions quietly, without guides or tickets, carrying their own copies of maps in leather cases. A few never came back. Their names were added to the same desert ledger that had recorded Waltz, Holmes, and Ruth before them. The paradox of the Dutchman's mind had only deepened. For the many, it was a story to tell over dinner, a photograph to send home, a souvenir map folded into a suitcase. For the few, it remained a silence worth dying for. Would you have been content to stand in a museum, staring at ore behind glass? Or would you have left the tour behind, walking further into the desert, hoping to be the one who finished the story? The mountains never cared. They offered folklore to the curious, silence to the devoted, and bones to the desperate. And they still hold the mine, or the absence of it, beneath their stone. By the end of the 20th century, the Dutchman's mine was less a location than a silence. The Superstition Mountains had absorbed generations of searchers, maps, and bones. Yet the ore that had once rested under Jacob Waltz's bed remained the only undeniable proof. Everything else was fragments. Silence was written in the objects left behind. Journals trailed into unfinished lines, Ink faded until the words could barely be traced. Maps folded into leather cases smelled faintly of smoke, the paper brittle from being opened and closed too often. Ore samples sat in glass, their flecks of gold gleaming under museum lights, admired but never explained. In living rooms, families still kept velvet chairs purchased with Waltz's gold, heirlooms that reminded them not of wealth, but of absence. Silence had weight. Those who walked the canyons at dusk described it pressing against their ears until they heard nothing but their own heartbeat. The heat carried no sound, only the smell of dust, dry and sharp, filling the mouth until water turned bitter. Even boots on stone echoed strangely, as if each step were swallowed whole. Every failure added to the silence, every disappearance deepened it. Bones found in washes, a skull placed upright by a trail, a pouch tied with faded thread, its contents never revealed. These fragments said more than words. They proved the mine was not only a legend, it was a silence that lived and grew heavier with each name the desert kept. Luxury carried a strange role in that silence, a silver ring still on a bone hand, glinting in the sun before being buried again. A notebook bound in calfskin, its last entry no more than a single word crossed through in red. A polished brass compass recovered from an abandoned camp, still pointing north, though its owner was gone. These objects became weight not because of what they were, but because of what they represented, proof that belief itself could outlast a man. Would you rather hold ore in your hands, heavy and certain, or ions in your memory, heavier still? Which endures longer, the gold buried beneath stone, or the grief passed through families, the regret written into unfinished ledgers? The weight of silence had become the real treasure. It could not be measured or sold or unearthed. It could only be carried, from Waltz to Holmes, from Brownie to Clay, from Ruth to every man who still walked the ridges with a map folded in his pocket. By the end of the century, silence had outlasted certainty, and in the ledger of the Superstition Mountains, it had become worth more than gold. By the late 20th century, the Dutchman's mine had moved almost entirely into the hands of heirs. The story no longer belonged to strangers wandering in with maps bought for $10 in Phoenix. It belonged to those who had inherited silence itself, men like Clay Worst, who became the guardian of the Holmes family's papers, journals, and fragments of ore. Clay had spent years listening to George Brownie Holmes, sitting with him at his ranch, while the old man traced ridges and cans onto paper. When Brownie died in 1980, his journals and ore samples did not vanish into auction rooms or gift shops. They went to Clay, who treated them not as property, but as something closer to a responsibility. Visitors who sat in Clay's home described the strange stillness of it. On shelves were leather-bound ledgers, their covers rubbed smooth, pages filled with sketches of landmarks that never quite matched the mountains outside. In a glass case sat a few ore samples, heavy and metallic, their scent sharp enough to cling to the hands that touched them. They were fragments of proof, but only fragments. No one could say where Waltz had taken them, or why he had left them under his bed. A chair in the corner, lined in velvet now worn thin, reminded visitors of Holmes's inheritance. It had been bought decades earlier with Waltz's gold, a small luxury that outlived every man who sat in it. The wood creaked softly when touched. The fabric smelled faintly of dust and time. It was not wealth anymore. It was a relic. Clay became the steward of these fragments. He showed them sparingly, only to those he trusted. Sometimes he would open a box and let visitors hold a piece of ore, cold and rough in the hand, heavier than it looked. Other times he would unroll a copy of Waltz's supposed map. The ink faded, the paper brittle, the landmarks more suggestion than instruction. He never promised answers. He only confirmed what was already known. The mine had never been found. There was tension in that stewardship. Should the clues be shared with the world, or should they be guarded, kept within a circle small enough that silence itself remained intact? Clay leaned toward the latter. He believed that to name the mine outright, to fix it too firmly on paper, would be to erase it. Would you have done the same? If the journals had been handed to you, would you open them for everyone to see, or fold them shut again, preserving the silence that gave them power? By then, the Dutchman's legend was split in two. For tourists, it was a story of skulls and treasure maps, sold in pamphlets and printed on postcards. For heirs like Clay, it was something heavier. It was the quiet knowledge that families had carried ore, velvet, and silence through generations, and that those fragments would never equal the whole. The mine had not been found, but its inheritance persisted, not in gold, but in the weight of objects that refused to vanish, or locked in cases, maps folded into leather, velvet chairs sagging under their own history, and so the final heirs carried what the desert itself had refused to give, fragments of truth, bound to silence, passed forward like treasure too heavy to spend. The story of the lost Dutchman's mine has lasted longer than Jacob Waltz, longer than Dick Holmes, longer even than Adolf Ruth. More than a century has passed, and still the superstitions hold their silence. What remains is not a mine, but fragments, ore samples locked in glass cases, their flecks of yellow gleaming under museum light. Velvet chairs, once bought with Waltz's hidden gold, now worn thin by generations who sat in them without knowing the weight they carried. Fine paper maps printed for tourists, folded into drawers, sold for more hope than truth. Leather-bound journals, their ink faded, their pages filled with sketches of ridges and rocks that never led to certainty. Each piece is evidence, and each piece is absence. Families carried these fragments as inheritance. Some guarded them like treasure. Others hid them away, ashamed of how much grief had been tied to them. But none could finish the sentence Waltz had started in 1891, when he lay dying with 48 pounds of ore beneath his bed and gave directions that ended in silence. The superstitions have not changed. The heat still presses hard against the skin. The air still tastes of dust and iron. Silence still grows heavy enough to drown a man's thoughts. Bones still turn up from time to time, pale against stone, reminders that obsession endures long after wealth fades. Would you have followed the fragments? Would you have trusted a velvet chair, a silver ring, or a folded map to lead you into canyons where silence is the only constant? Or would you have walked away, leaving the awe and the absence buried together? The ledger of the Superstition Mountains does not end with answers. It ends with silence heavier than gold. But this story is not the last. In our next video, why a treasure hunter spent 7 years on gold that may not exist. We follow a modern seeker who gave nearly a decade of his life to another legend, convinced that treasure was waiting just beyond the next ridge. What drove him to sacrifice so much for something that may never have been there at all? If this story lingered with you, let us know. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, so the next forgotten ledger finds you first, before the silence does.